I am İhsan Yılmaz. I am a research professor at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. I also a senior non-resident fellow at the European Center for Populism Studies. I've been working on authoritarianism, Islamism, populism, emotions, and digital technologies. And my research has been funded by Australian Research Council, Gerda Henkel Foundation, and several others. And I am very glad to be organizing this series together with the ECPS, and I'll try to be moderating this session. My connection is a little bit weak, so if I'm gone, my colleague Fan will take over moderation. Thank you. And we are starting this seminar series with a giant in the field who came up with the term sharp power. And he's been disseminating his ideas on sharp power and publishing in prestigious journals. So I'll just read his bio before starting, and then he will take over. Christopher Walker is Vice President for Studies and Analysis at the National Endowment for Democracy, an independent nonprofit foundation dedicated to the growth and strengthening of democratic institutions around the world. In his capacity, he oversees the department that's responsible for NED's multifaceted analytical work. Prior to joining the NED, Walker was Vice President for Strategy and Analysis at Freedom House, another influential and prestigious think tank. Walker has testified before legislative committees, appears regularly in the media, and frequently conducts briefings on critical issues relating to democratic development. He has been at the forefront of discussions on authoritarian influence on democratic systems. His articles have appeared in numerous publications, including the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, and the Journal of Democracy. He is co-editor of the edited volume Authoritarianism Goes Global, The Challenge to Democracy, and co-editor of the reports Sharp Power, Rising Authoritarian Influence, and another one, Sharp Power and Democratic Resilience. His article, Rising to the Sharp Power Challenge, appears in the October 2022 issue of the Journal of Democracy. His title today is Authoritarian Mobilization and Sharp Power. And he kindly suggested that instead of giving a long talk, he will just talk about 15 minutes, and then he wants us to ask him as many questions as well as we like. So without further ado, please welcome Chris Walker. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Professor Yilmaz. Really appreciate the invitation to join you all today and to share some ideas and have a discussion. As Professor Yilmaz indicated, I'll touch on several aspects of the issue at hand. And I've titled this discussion Authoritarian Mobilization and Sharp Power, because I think it's fair to say that we're already quite deep into a changed and more hostile environment for democracy, which is on the one hand challenged and suffering its own weaknesses at the moment, but at the same time, it's fair to say that authoritarianism has been resurgent for quite a number of years now, by some counts at least a decade and a half. But one feature of this new environment is clearly activist, internationally minded authoritarian regimes that have engaged in a wide range of spheres and domains. And I think the term authoritarian mobilization captures this. There's been mobilization over a protracted period. In the most recent period, you can read the news and see China's engagement in ports around the world, in law enforcement setting up police stations in dozens of countries, in all settings globally, and developing its media capacity, just to name three areas that have gotten recent attention. But this challenge and this mobilization far exceeds those domains. And so it's fair to say that the emergence of internationalist authoritarian regimes has been a feature of the present era. But at the same time, it's important to note that the authorities in China, as well as Russia and other such regimes, work relentlessly to deny their own people the right to participate in the governments of their countries. Along with other repressive regimes, and I might include in this list Cuba, Iran, Saudi Arabia, they exert influence beyond their borders and increasingly view democratic publics abroad in a manner similar to their own populations, and that is to say, as hostile forces needing to be manipulated and controlled. Why is this so? Authoritarian regimes, unlike liberal democracies, rely on a combination of repression, ideological dogma, and political censorship to survive. Autocrats maintain control by monopolizing the generation and dissemination of ideas, building on years of repression and increasingly stifling censorship. Russian President Vladimir Putin has turned Russia effectively into a police state. Since Russia's full-blown invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the Kremlin has gone so far as to ban calling it a, quote, war or invasion, and the authorities prefer the term special operation. Violators of this ban can be given up to 15 years in prison. China, for its part, has built a formidable censorship regime, increasingly through the use of cutting-edge technology. For instance, the so-called Great Firewall aims to seal off internet users in China from the rest of the world, blocking access to Western sites such as Google and Twitter. Alternative Chinese platforms such as WeChat offer users online conveniences that enable greater censorship and monitoring. These are just one part of a wide-ranging, comprehensive censorship and control apparatus that increasingly relies on automation and big data capabilities, along with a massive effort to collect DNA from millions of people, basically to entrap the Chinese population in an integrated and omnipresent web of surveillance. But in an era of globalization, the authoritarian powers' domestic standards and behaviors don't remain cleanly contained within their own borders. The fall of the Soviet Union and China's embrace of market reforms have produced thick interconnections between autocracies and democracies. And as hopes that these ties would encourage political reform in autocracies faded, the authoritarians have effectively taken the offensive. Autocrats have developed more interactive, multidimensional, and often nuanced ways to project influence in a bid to realize their strategic objectives. This influence is also often accompanied by forms of manipulation and political censorship. For instance, as part of the CCP's program of global engagement, Chinese authorities now are training officials from developing countries on censoring the internet, controlling civil society, and building a single-party regime. Australian society, a number of years ago, woke up to the China challenge to its democracy. Over the past 2 decades, the Chinese party state increased its intrusive activities in Australia across a wide range of sectors. The scholar John Fitzgerald of Swinburne University has described how Beijing's integrated networks of influence have 4 key goals. The first is to directly control Chinese language media in Australia. The second is to cow community groups and universities into suppressing criticism of the PRC. The third is to shape the foreign policy preferences of political parties. And the fourth, in his view, was to build a formal presence of the CCP's international arm, the United Front Work Department. And for instance, Australian stations owned by Beijing's China Radio International at one point was running programs supporting Beijing's claims while ignoring other views. As non-military activities falling outside the scope of hard power, these influence efforts have commonly been described as soft power. But this framing is inadequate and has led to a dangerous complacency among many democracies. Unlike soft power, which is understood to rely on attraction, these influence efforts of the sort Australia faced often rely on manipulation and outward-facing forms of censorship. In 2017, my colleague Jessica Ludwig and I first described these influence activities as sharp power because they pierce and penetrate the political and information environments of the targeted countries in order to monopolize ideas, suppress alternative narratives, and exploit partner institutions. Since the inception of the term, awareness of the sharp power challenge has grown considerably, especially as supporting evidence has come into the public domain. This includes terrific work by scholars such as John Fitzgerald, who's described the challenge in Australia. I'd also note the work of John Garneau, which has really been first-rate in this respect, and other incredible analysts and scholars who've done work in the Czech Republic, like Martin Hala, and in Taiwan, like Hetty Chen, all who have brought some of the specific instances of these forms of influence into the public discussion in recent years. But it's also important to note that the autocrats are adapting, and by and large, the democracies have struggled to develop systematic, adequate strategies to hold repressive regimes accountable or to address the autocrats' sophisticated and compromising forms of international influence. Most democracies have yet to take critical steps to reduce their vulnerabilities and are at best in the early stages of tackling the threats posed, for example, by the secrecy, elite capture, and divide and conquer tactics that are integral to the authoritarians' outward-facing engagement. Free societies, therefore, must come to grips with the new reality and develop more purposeful means of reversing this authoritarian momentum. I think it's also fair to say that authoritarian regimes have been waging an active assault on democracy for quite a protracted period of time, and the effects of this battering are now clearly visible. The authorities in countries from as diverse as Afghanistan to Zimbabwe have launched, in many cases, massive crackdowns, and often with impunity. Cooperation and learning among these repressive regimes has been normalized, and while China is often touted as an economic miracle, it's effectively become a police state as well, a high-tech dystopia whose leaders are eager to reshape the global tech realm to fit their authoritarian visions. And I'd note, just as a way of looking over the last generation, I think it's also the case that free societies' misguided assumptions about the inevitable triumph of liberal democracy have only worsened the authoritarian challenge. And in the wake of the Cold War, Western democracies were convinced that deep engagement with countries like Russia and China, particularly economic integration, would yield clear mutual benefits and encourage meaningful political reform in those countries. During this period, the West welcomed the PRC into the international system, believing that doing so would lead it to develop into a responsible stakeholder. But in retrospect, the democracies made a crucial error in their engagement with the autocracies. Free societies largely put aside their own inherent competitive advantage, the principles of democratic accountability and transparency, by turning a blind eye to the authoritarians' corrupt practices in many cases, succumbing to self-censorship, and otherwise letting the authoritarians set the terms of engagement. Democracies and many of their key institutions ceded much ground in terms of values. Universities in open societies, for instance, were far too permissive in allowing Chinese-affiliated cultural and language centers, known as Confucius Institutes, onto their campuses. And over time, authoritarian regimes asserted their own preferences. One could argue that by pursuing chiefly transactional engagement with the West, China and Russia effectively reverse-engineered the logic of change through trade, exploiting globalization to their advantage. With a first mover advantage and a keen ability to adapt, the authoritarians have taken the initiative. Their momentum has spread and intensified tyranny around the world. Democracy, meanwhile, has been in decline for more than a decade and a half, as I noted, and this is according to the excellent work done by the monitoring organization Freedom House. And I think it's really important in this context to recognize that the global authoritarian offensive and mobilization isn't limited simply to the repression of individual activists or advocacy groups. It's far more ambitious. Leading authoritarian powers are targeting the minds and seeking to alter the behaviors of democratic publics through institutions, including universities, publishers, media outlets, entertainment companies, and often technology firms. Think tanks and policy institutes are similarly contending with authoritarian encroachments. These knowledge sector institutions in particular are critical to the functioning of democracy and now confront serious asymmetries in their relationships with authoritarian powers that have left them open to sharp power efforts to compromise their integrity. So for example, as Glenn Tifford observes in the Journal of Democracy, foreign scholars of China, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates have encountered a range of repressive tactics that Tifford describes. China and Russia in particular have built out formidable global media infrastructures, which increasingly collaborate with media enterprises in democracies and autocracies alike in order to disseminate friendly messages about their regimes and to block critical coverage of them. For instance, the content from the Russian state-owned news agency Sputnik is free to use, whereas Reuters and other international news agencies charge their clients for their services. Another part of the Kremlin's media strategy includes hidden or indirect pressure, such as opaque foreign media financing and disguised mergers and acquisitions, and may involve foreign news outlets that have no overt connection to Russia. These methods have enabled the Russian authorities to pollute foreign media ecosystems and manipulate their audiences. The CCP's media strategy now includes, in addition to positive messages about the Chinese state and the regime, more bellicose and corrosive narratives targeting perceived enemies. And I'd note on this count that it wasn't all that long ago that many observers felt it was unlikely that the Chinese state media strategy would include more bellicose, negative, and disinformation-related activities rather than simply promoting the ostensible virtues of the Chinese state. The scope and scale of China's engagement is also apparent now in the entertainment industry. Scholar Ayin Kokas explains that the CCP increasingly relies less on attractive power of Chinese media corporations as partners than on threats to cut off access to the Chinese market, as part of what she's described as the weaponization of corporations' dependence on political authorities for market access to control content. Through this controlling approach, the Chinese authorities have effectively conditioned powerful institutions in free societies to limit what they say about topics that Beijing deems sensitive. The fact is that the authoritarians' outward-facing influence efforts now have reached every corner of the world. The Russian authorities, for example, push ideas and concepts through local academia and modern media in Latin America. China is building a large media infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa that's reshaping that region's information ecosystem, and the effects of which remain poorly understood. Russia's also built out its engagement in Africa, it's worth noting, and this is all too often to the detriment of the continent's stability and the democracies that operate there. So let me say a word about how the scaling up of this investment in the forms of outward-facing investment by these authoritarian powers have impacted our understanding and the terminology associated with these activities, especially as it relates to soft power. I think it's worth noting that despite the vast resources the authoritarian trendsetters have poured into sectors like media, education, technology, and entertainment, public opinion surveys suggest that they're largely failing to generate soft power, the ability to get people to view a country positively and obtain preferred outcomes by attraction rather than coercion. Recent survey data released by the Pew Research Center illustrates this contradiction. It shows in China's case that negative views predominate, some of these at historic highs across a diverse set of publics assessed. Among citizens, for example, of Sweden and Canada, 83 and 74% respectively view China unfavorably, as do 86% of Australians and 80% of South Koreans. The seeming contradiction between the authoritarians' growing investment in international influence and persistently negative views of these powers abroad is evident in other recent research, like the European think tank network on China's 2021 report titled China's Soft Power in Europe, Falling on Hard Times. This report examined 17 countries in which China's soft power, as they were assessing it, was largely determined to be failing, with title after title repeating the same theme in the report. So for example, there were titles like China's soft power in the Czech Republic, almost a fiasco, China's dwindling soft power in Sweden, and limited appeal, China's soft power in the United Kingdom. Virtually all of the titles in this edited volume are along these lines. And the conundrum isn't really entirely new. In a 2017 article entitled "China is Spending Billions to Make the World Love It," The Economist magazine detailed the vast resources that the Chinese Communist Party's efforts to sell itself as a brand overseas and to attract other people from countries around the world. The article described how the Chinese state outreach spanned multiple fronts, including educational initiatives, global state media expansion, and the rapid scaling up of commerce and development programs. And the authors in this article reached the conclusion that these wide-ranging investments, quote, have not brought China anything like the love it would like. So what are the possible explanations for the authoritarian regime's unimpressive return on their investment in foreign influence? So there's several factors, I think, that contribute to this contradiction. The first is that the dynamics of soft power, which arise principally from a country's culture, its political values and policies, are misaligned with incentives of systems that are based on pervasive state control and repression. As Joseph Nye has emphasized, much soft power arises from societal forces outside of government control, such as individuals, civil society, and the private sector. Accordingly, China could generate more soft power if it would relax some of its tight party control over civil society, as Nye notes. But the leadership in Beijing, as well as the leadership in Moscow, Riyadh, and Havana, have put preservation of state control above all else. While these regimes pursue outward-facing engagement, the state's firm hand does not magically disappear. For instance, targets of CCP influence activities are often under the mistaken impression that media, academic, and friendship organizations operate independently from the party. But most, if not all, of the Chinese entities that engage with their peers abroad unequivocally serve national party goals, either by following official or unofficial guidelines, or by avoiding taking positions that might violate CCP guidelines or jeopardize the regime's goals. In principle, the Chinese or Russian leaderships could boost their soft power by relaxing their grip, for example, on civil society and easing systematic repression on independent media or opposition figures. In practice, there's little evidence to suggest that they're inclined to do so. Another factor is that the metrics commonly used to identify soft power at work are ill-suited to the task of assessing the nature of China and Russia's foreign influence. Public opinion surveys, which have served as the go-to measure for soft power success, may be able to reveal a given country's favorability among certain audiences. They're not, however, an appropriate instrument for measuring the extent to which a foreign power is co-opting local elites, inducing forms of political censorship, or engaging in strategic corruption that can compromise the integrity of local institutions. This is critical as evidence mounts to indicate that authoritarian regimes are exerting real outward-facing effects, but not those expected in a soft power context. In the absence of metrics that are better suited to assessing the effects and outcomes produced in these cases, for instance, political censorship and strategic corruption, we end up in an analytical cul-de-sac, often with troubling policy implications. It's not necessarily the case, say, if China's public image is faltering, as understood through opinion surveys, that China's influence is waning. Rather, Beijing may be projecting influence outside of the soft power context. Open societies will be vulnerable so long as they maintain a blind spot about the compromising and corrosive aspects of authoritarians' outward-facing influence, rather than devoting so much energy to figuring out on why countries such as China and Russia are so unable to exert soft power. Scholars and journalists instead should devote some more attention in their field of vision to the increasingly evident, yet still often poorly understood, authoritarian strategies that prioritize corrosion and control over attraction and persuasion. So let me just say in conclusion that I think there's evidence to suggest that most free societies still are not adequately prepared to meet the multidimensional sharp power strategies employed by China, Russia, and like-minded states. Authoritarians' international engagement often tends to mimic their domestic governance, often including outward-facing censorship, elite capture, and corrupting practices. There are a number of countries who face the challenge, including, I would say, Australia, the Czech Republic, Lithuania, and Taiwan, that have achieved some success in confronting threats to their integrity, to the integrity of their democratic institutions, and can offer some important lessons. In each of these countries, the non-governmental sector, for example, played an important role in alerting policymakers and the public at large to authoritarian encroachments by producing reliable yet easy to understand information and analysis, fostering needed debate, and stimulating resilience through openness and transparency. These efforts, in turn, spurred governmental responses that shifted the public mindset from complacency to needed action. Such countries are unusual, however, that unlike most states, they possess some critical features that are essential for addressing these forms of authoritarian influence. In most of these cases, they drew upon civil society and news media to present crucial issues without fear or favor. Importantly, these countries, and I would note especially Australia, the Czech Republic, and Taiwan, had independent China expertise to inform wider society about authoritarian influence in a clear-eyed and well-informed manner. Russia knowledge is crucial for the same purpose, I would suggest. But apart from a small subset of countries, including those I've just mentioned, there are really few equipped to address the China or Russia challenge in a systematic way. And I think these vulnerabilities are especially visible in places like Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. So finally, I'd say that the stakes for implementing a proactive democratic response to sharp power are rising as emerging technology offers autocrats the promise of even greater influence at once unimaginable scale. And China, Russia, and other autocracies in many ways are only scratching the surface of their technological capabilities in this regard. Unless democratic societies are able to rise to the challenge by leveraging their own competitive advantages, such as creativity, freedom of expression, openness, and accountability, the sharp power challenge is bound to continue to mount. And so maybe I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. That's very great. And I'm sure we will have many questions. But let me start asking you one empirical question, another conceptual question. The first one, the empirical question, is the authoritarian regimes sometimes collaborate with each other. In the literature, this is also called authoritarian diffusion. How does authoritarian diffusion and sharp power work? What I mean is that, do they learn from each other, their sharp power techniques, strategies, etc.? And also, do they export and import these know-how and also technologies when it comes to these? Are there any empirical evidence on that front? And the conceptual question, how can we differentiate sharp power and hard power when the idea of war or invasion is being conceptualized? For example, the manifestation of war is no longer limited to military invasion and violence, but cyber warfare, information warfare, platform governance, trolling, etc. And another question, this is sort of conceptual, empirical, mixed. I've been applying your concept of sharp power to Turkey and India. I haven't published yet, but I see that these countries, they also work through their diasporas. because they have diasporas in democratic societies, and you talk about penetration to democratic institutions, weakening these institutions, etc. But through diasporas also, they are trying to penetrate the societies. Sometimes what Turkey does, for instance, in Bulgaria and in even Belgium, they establish pro-Turkish parties and try to lobby these governments, disrupt the processes, etc. So would you consider adding this diaspora dimension to the sharp power conceptualization? And also another thing that Turkey, for instance, has been doing, that it's been using TV series, TV historical dramas to disseminate anti-Western messages, conspiracy theories about the West, disinformation. So they are projecting sort of fake historical stories onto today and framing the West as the enemy, crusader, conspiring against Islam and Muslim societies, etc. And Turkey has been disseminating these ideas and this narrative in Muslim majority societies, but also among Muslim minorities in the West as well. So would you also think that this is also part of sharp power? Thank you.
So I think there's a growing body of supporting evidence to indicate that either through passive or perhaps more active means, authoritarian regimes are cooperating and learning from each other. The work done by Anne Applebaum in the recent past to explore what she's describing as Autocracy, Inc., I think gets at this on a wide range of levels. And she really does a terrific job of describing in so many domains the growing forms of cooperation. Some of this has been in view for quite some time. I think the ways in which authoritarian regimes support each other in the international norms organizations, including at the UN, has been visible. I think the change over time is that the depth and the extent of this interaction has become more visible. There's clearly opportunities that are afforded through the digital revolution. And so, for example, you see increasingly in Latin America and the Spanish language that Russian state media is incredibly active there. There are indications that Russian state media will, at a minimum, align itself, for example, with Telesur, and increasingly there seems to be indications that Chinese state media are active there. Whether they are precisely aligning their editorial activities, that may not be clear, but I think the overarching ways in which they're shaping arguments and framing discussions seem to have alignment, and there's an increasing body of work to suggest this. I think the preferences of authoritarian regimes also help give a sense of the way in which they will align. So, for example, most of these governments that I've alluded to prefer to limit freedom of expression at the domestic level and manipulate discourse. And I think their preference is to do so beyond their borders, even if they can't do it quite the same way they do it at home, because they won't control all of the key relevant institutions like the judiciary, like the news media, like civil society, when they're operating beyond their borders. But I think what we've seen certainly in the last 10 to 15 years is that the Russian authorities, the Chinese authorities, and their surrogates will do their best to try to control and manipulate the debate beyond their borders and support each other when they can. And I'm happy to say a little bit more about the authoritarian cooperation issue, but I think it's not always clear that there is active cooperation, but I think you see what might be described as passive cooperation or learning by observation in the way that certain approaches are used. in terms of whether these regimes are quote unquote exporting their model, I think it's possible, but I don't think it's necessary to use that framing. I think there are negative externalities that are visible from engagement, say from the Chinese party state, that are adverse for the integrity of democratic institutions. So for example, the corruption that seems to accompany commercial engagement when the Chinese party state engages overseas, or the self-censorship, the chilling effect on a number of issues that the Chinese authorities deem to be unwelcome. This, for the longest period of time, were issues like Taiwan, Tibet, Tiananmen Square. But over time, the sorts of issues that have become unwelcome by the authorities have extended to include Xinjiang, the Uyghur Autonomous Region, corruption issues relating to the Chinese authorities. And you can see the circle of issues that have become unwelcome have extended, and China's interlocutors often will steer clear of these issues. I think before, say, the last 5 or 6 years, there was far less research available in the public domain to support the notion that this sort of censorship was taking place. I think today we're in a much better position to look at the work of a long list of scholars. I mentioned some of them earlier, but I would add to that list scholars like Sarah Cook at Freedom House, Samantha Hoffman at ASPE, the work that Merrick's is doing in Berlin. There are a number of scholars there, and others that have been looking at this, have brought out into the public domain the extent to which there's been suppression of issues that should properly have a public airing. And I think there too, it isn't really essential to agree that there's an export of a model per se. I think the fact that these practices and standards as negative externalities are now impacting a larger number of systems and societies is something that we should be concerned about, take note of, and figure out ways to guard against, often through better forms of collective action, tightening up standards, say in the university setting, so that the leadership in universities understand that freedom of expression and academic freedom should be sacrosanct and shouldn't be compromised in these issues. But I think only when you have a discussion and understand these issues better with supporting evidence behind them, can you then take the steps to address them. On the distinction between hard and sharp power, I think broadly speaking, the understanding of hard power has largely been in the kinetic context and through coercion. I would contend that, at least in the way we've made the argument of sharp power's effects in terms of inducing forms of censorship, trying to monopolize or dominate discussion or debate, and otherwise harm the integrity of institutions with which these authoritarian forces are interacting. It isn't always a purely coercive engagement. I think it can be coercive, but often the engagements are not overtly coercive, and yet the interlocutors feel obliged to steer clear of certain topics or change their behavior in ways that are inconsistent with free expression, for example, or academic freedom or media freedom writ large. And I think this nuanced aspect of the ways in which influence has been exerted by authoritarian regimes, first and foremost, the Chinese party state, really requires focused attention to ensure that, and I'll be more explicit, I think in settings where it's not so clear that you can rely, say, on law enforcement agencies to do the job, it's really important that the leadership in democratic institutions and open societies take the steps to shore up what they're doing. So there have been examples in countries as diverse as Canada, Australia, the United States, and many others, where students or employees at academic institutions have been intimidated or hounded in one way or another. There have also been instances of outright espionage and theft of intellectual property. I think the questions relating to intellectual property theft and espionage and such forms of activity really require law enforcement or official agencies engagement. There are a whole set of forms of intimidation or influence or interference that may not actually rise to the level of law enforcement engagement, but may really require meaningful responses from the leadership at these institutions to ensure that their own standards are upheld. And so there too, I think the distinction more broadly between hard and sharp power can put the hard power discussion more in the kinetic domain, and the sharp power can embody these sorts of activities that induce censorship and other such behaviors and reactions in the way we've described them. And just very briefly on your question, which is in a way related to the globalization of information and the way in which diasporas have evolved. Clearly, a growing number of governments are paying greater attentions to their diasporas, which in some ways is perfectly fine to engage them and reach them. I would say that the real test, at least in my view, from a sharp power perspective, is if the engagement aims to limit debate or manipulate discussion. And maybe I'll just use as an example the way in which the Chinese authorities operate in this context. And there are some examples that I've cited in work that we've done relating to Australia, but I think this is true elsewhere. The Chinese authorities have worked incredibly hard to limit the possibility for alternative points of view in the Chinese language, even beyond the borders of the PRC. And to my mind, that's a real problem. So now the ambition, it seems, is to maximize the likelihood that people of Chinese heritage or seeking information in the Chinese language beyond the PRC can only find information that is consistent with the views of the Chinese authorities. And I think that's something we should be also quite concerned about. I think Russia has similar ambitions as well. So to the extent that there are pluralistic and open discussions, I think that's fine. I think what we're seeing in these cases are efforts to limit or otherwise skew or suppress discussion even beyond borders, and that's a problem.
Thank you. Anita has a question in the chat. Anita, would you like to ask the question yourself? Can you hear me?
Yes, of course. So my question is that whether there are any ways for democracies to dislodge authoritarian overreach on the internet without themselves implementing semi-authoritarian or enroaching policies that affect internet neutrality and free speech online, and whether democracies can walk this line. They can create or enforce laws which are strictly punishing only the sharp power actors. Thank you.
Thank you.
So it's a terrific question, and I would suggest that it speaks to some of these very complicated asymmetries that have emerged, and also have challenged, I think, some of the assumptions that many observers had, say, going back 20 years ago or so, that the internet would, through its openness, propel freedom of speech and democracy. And of course, in many ways, the digital revolution has been quite positive and incredible in terms of availing greater information to more people and opening opportunities for communication and discussion. But I think, as you're suggesting in your question, authoritarian powers who systematically seek to manipulate and skew information have realized a pretty remarkable opportunity for themselves to engage in the open domains provided by the internet, and to do that at scale. And I think this is really the challenge we face now, that through automation and through prioritization of engagement in the internet domain, countries, including but not limited to China and Russia, can really engage and manipulate the space. And I think democratic systems and societies are struggling, as you suggest, Anita, to find ways to safeguard the integrity of the open internet space on the one hand, but at the same time not drift into the sort of policies that would start to itself serve as a form of censorship. And there aren't, I would say, perfect answers or policies to address this. There are many groups and people working on this and have very creative ideas, but I suspect we're still in the relative early stages of sorting out the ways to, on the one hand, make sure that there's not only open expression, but expression that isn't systematically polluted in the way that, for example, the Russian authorities have been very adept at doing just about everywhere around the globe. And at the same time, not start to fall into the trap of adopting policies that would then become censorious in their own right.
Thank you. Fan?
Yeah, thanks, Isam. Thanks, Christopher, for their thought-provoking presentation. So I have a conceptual question based on, the idea of border, and you have also mentioned authoritarian mobilization. So our conceptualization of power in international relations is actually largely based on the segregation of nation states, territory, and also the discussion around sovereignties as well. So how do you think the current international relations that are defined by authoritarian spheres or authoritarian regimes or authoritarian alliances instead of authoritarian nations? For example, China's Belt and Road initiatives, China-Russia alliance, Five Eye alliance, and how this kind of international or transnational alliances, they will be able to challenge the established norm in international politics.
So thank you for the terrific question. I would first of all commend the audience to the terrific work of Alexander Cooley, who I think was ahead of the curve on some of these critical questions of how authoritarian states themselves were forming their own groupings and alliances as a way to counter and offer an alternative to the groupings that, at least coming out of the Cold War in the 1980s, were seen as the likely norm setters. These would include groups like the OSCE and, of course, the United Nations. I think some of the groups you alluded to and others, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, took shape over time and themselves have had the ambition of setting norms. Thomas Ginsburg of the University of Chicago has written of the emergence of authoritarian international law. He has a wonderful article on this topic in the Journal of Democracy and makes some compelling arguments that not only are individual authoritarian powers seeking to impose and exert their preferences and vision, but now they're doing this in ways that are more collaborative and seeking to reshape things at a higher order level. I think this was really unanticipated, at least from the perspective of 30 years ago. I think the assumption at the time was that democratic human rights oriented norms would carry the day. And in a way, democratic systems were caught off guard in the sense that many of these authoritarian regimes are making arguments about the ways in which a hyper focused version of sovereignty should be privileged. such that the authorities in countries should have unchecked ability to treat and even repress their own populations, to sideline and set aside key UN tenets or other international, more universally oriented norms and standards. And I think there's been a very powerful and concerted effort by the authoritarian powers to make this argument. So, for example, China makes an argument that we should privilege civilizational diversity, which at one level sounds very interesting, but embedded in that idea is that we should set aside the notion that there are universal standards that respect the individual's rights. And I think we really need to reflect on that and make certain that democratic governments are prioritizing the safeguarding of these rights and respond to this challenge that has emerged in earnest in the recent past. It's something I think we've underestimated, and now in many respects we're playing catch up on in terms of responding to the authoritarian challenge.
Okay, we have 3 minutes to go. We have a few more questions, but we will publish this. We will transcribe the discussion, and we will send it to Chris for his revision, and maybe we can add a few more questions that we couldn't ask right now, so that maybe he will have an opportunity to respond to these questions. But Kainat, you have a question? I can't hear you.
Sorry, before that, Martin has one ready, if that's all right.
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah.
Yes, Martin,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. I just had a question. You mentioned the sale of the port of Hamburg earlier in your presentation, and I just wanted to know that, or just ask, that sparked a pretty big debate over the sort of economic influence held by China in Europe, and these tensions over certain politicians and governments choosing to carry on with these sort of policies despite concerns and sort of impopularity with citizens and with organizations. Can we still categorize these choices, knowing that Russia has invaded Ukraine, that China has re-elected Xi Jinping, as sort of willful ignorance, or do you see this trend sort of continue, sort of like in preferring economic choices over sort of being hard towards China?
So thanks very much for the question. It's really a terrific one, and maybe this can be a good one to conclude on. Just one note, I think it's important to say that China as such did not re-elect Xi Jinping. He has an additional term of service there, but I don't think it's fair to say certainly that the Chinese people elected him. I think you've touched on the ongoing challenge, and you're absolutely right. In the case of the Port of Hamburg, I think positively it stimulated a very vigorous discussion in Germany and by extension in other parts of Europe, which is a very good thing. I think part of what's needed is a vigorous discussion that ensures that policymakers and the wider public in countries that have to make these kinds of decisions have a chance to talk these things through in a serious way and then make an informed decision. All too often, in many cases, I think what we've discovered in our research, and I think the great research done by others looking at these issues, is that when there are big decisions taken on infrastructure, on adopting tech platforms, on ports in countries of all kinds around the world, it's often the case that there isn't a meaningful debate in society. It's often the case that these decisions are taken through executive branch officials with their interlocutors from China, and to the exclusion, or at least the minimization, of participation by independent media or the parliament, civil society, and so forth. Much healthier from a democratic perspective to have vigorous discussion of the issues up front, hash it out, and if society determines that on balance it's a good idea to proceed, that's fine. I think part of the challenge is that China, in many cases, has been very adept at co-opting or capturing elites, which can then skew the decision-making process. And this is something that looks to be, really requires more attention, I think, in any number of settings. And in the larger picture, I think what we need to do is to continue the ability to put into context the sorts of initiatives and projects that are discussed, whether it's a port, whether it's a digital project, whether it's a media project, whether it's a country deciding it's going to have a Chinese police agency on its territory. I think in many of these instances, these things happen virtually in the dark. I think in the case of the Port of Hamburg, there was a much more vigorous discussion there, but I think as you're suggesting, it still speaks to the need for a deeper understanding of what the negative externalities may be from economic engagement, that is to say the non-economic costs and costs that may impact the integrity of democratic institutions or standards that can accompany economic engagement, whether it's the port agreement or any other sort of economic interaction. And so I think that's really the charge for open societies now, is to deepen their own expertise, to make sure that their standards are upheld, and this will be really critical for meeting the challenge over time.
Thank you, Chris. And there are, as I said, several other questions, but we will send them to you in writing when we are working on the report. So ECPS will publish this talk series as a report. And we have 6 more sessions to go, and people from different countries will be applying the concept sharp power to different contexts, different situations, and so on. And then we will transcribe all these talks and Q&As, and hopefully we'll come up with a great report, and it will be widely distributed not only in the European Union in Brussels, but also in other parts of the world. So every Wednesday until the 21st of December, we will have a session. 4 of them will be solo speakers, but then we will have 2 panel discussions as well. So we will be having, I think, 10 different great scholars who have been applying the concept of sharp power to different scenarios. Thank you, Chris. It's been a great discussion and debate, and I'm sure this is just the beginning for us. So we hope to be continuing to talk to you and expand on your concept and keep debating the issue. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
And thank you very well. I appreciate it. Take care.